So this semester I decided to do an action research project, and when I was first considering it, my ultimate goal was to improve the classroom environment, have students be more engaged, and just to make classroom management a little easier and a little more effective. So in looking at some approaches to accomplishing that objective, I zeroed in on formative assessments. Now, as many of you know, there are a variety of types of formative assessments, from just homework, classwork, questioning by the teacher, ticket out the doors, observing group work, and also self-assessment. So for my action research, I actually decided to focus on the self-assessment aspect of my classroom because I felt like that was a type of formative assessment that I had never really tried. So I wanted to see how it worked. So in looking at some of the information and research about self-assessments, what I learned was that it was a way for students to take ownership of their learning, and I certainly wanted that to happen in my classroom. I also found out that it would require the teacher to transfer a lot of the power and responsibility of learning in the classroom to the student, which ultimately is what we want to do as they get older and move toward high school. I also found out that self-assessments can give the teacher instructional feedback in terms of how well the lessons are working and what the students are understanding from the lessons that are being taught. And ultimately, I was excited to find out that they would hopefully improve the engagement of the students and ultimately the classroom environment, which was my original goal. So the research from Black and William as well as Sadler basically said that self-assessment is essential to learning and that students need to make decisions about their own learning, not just the teachers making all of the decisions. However, another aspect of the research from Bishop and Flom said that self-assessment is a process, not only for teachers but also for students, and that it is expected that students have to learn how to actually use the self-assessments to help their own learning and not just see it as something the teacher is giving them to do. And the teachers have to learn how to administer effective self-assessments and utilize the data in an effective way as it relates to their instructional practices. So for my action research, I chose to use my 5th period class. It is an 8th grade science class, and we were doing a 3-week water quality unit. Now, one other reason, a side note, that this was a great unit to use for this action research was this was a new part of our curriculum last year. So a lot of our activities are newer and they haven't been tried and true through the years by our PLT. So this was also a good opportunity to kind of look at the effectiveness of some of these activities. So I gave a survey at the very beginning just to get an idea of students' perceptions in the classroom. And then I did, over the 3-week period, I did 6 self-assessments with the students. So the formats of the assessment were varied, and I started with what I considered more basic self-assessments, like a ticket out the door and kind of a how well did you understand the lesson today. And then I moved toward a checklist and multiple choice type questions, and then a minute paper, which was also kind of a ticket out the door procedure, but they had a minute to write down everything that they remembered with their notes closed and only their memory, and that was really informative for me as far as what they had learned in the classroom. And then at the very end, I had them reflect on a lesson that we had done in their own words, answering a couple of questions. So my original thought was that the progression of the formats would be from easier to requiring more metacognition on the part of the students, but in the end, after doing this action research, I actually think that maybe I would do the opposite direction if I were to do this again and have them start out with more reflective questions so that they would realize that this was a process that was for them and not for me, and then in the end move toward more checklist formats. So some of the things that I reflected on in this process, or the things that came up that I wanted to know more about, was why don't they ask questions? They put in some of their surveys and as well as their answers to the self-assessments that they had questions, but then they weren't willing to ask them given the opportunity. And then their quiz grades also showed that they had questions that they were not willing to answer. So that could be a variety of reasons, from social to developmental, or just the large class sizes that we have. And then I felt like, it was just my intuition, that many of them felt like it was just another task that they had to complete for me and not a tool for them to use. And so I think that if this were a longer year-long process, I would be able to gradually show them that this was a tool for them. It was not a grade. It was not something that I was making them do, but it was something for their own benefit to help their own learning. And I also realized with a lot of the checklist that I had them do, that they are not doing pre-tasks, such as reading directions and looking at graphs before trying to answer questions and thoroughly reading the background information. So I do feel like that was another thing I learned from this process, is that I may need to do a better job of making sure that they understand the importance of doing some of those pre-learning tasks. So again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most beneficial and most informative aspects of the feedback that I got was the minute paper. And I just really felt like that gave me an idea of what stood out to the students, any misconceptions that they had, and where they may need more instruction. So I definitely think that is a technique that I will use in the future. And I also really like the reflection. Even though some of the students didn't put that much down, I think it would also be a process, and their free writing and their own words were a lot more powerful than checking agree or disagree on a survey type self-assessment. So I guess in conclusion, what I would suggest for others looking at trying out this process is definitely make it a year-long process and not something that you try to do quickly, because you are going to need to get used to it yourself and train the students in the concept that it will help them, and it's not just something they're doing for your class. And then I would also say ultimately how it would change my instructional practices is I feel like I have learned that students do need to take more ownership into their own learning, and I feel like one way I could facilitate that is to give them more choice in assignments. And some of the research had pointed toward doing that type of process in the classroom, giving students several different options for projects and even several different options for their unit assessments, and that would help them for more of the buy-in. So I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about my action research and that it has inspired you to also look into self-assessments in your own classroom.